What is up, guys, and welcome back to yet another benchmarking video. It's been a minute since I last did one of this, but today we are going to be benchmarking the AMD Radeon 9070 XT that has 16 gigs of VRAM, and this GPU is going to be benchmarked, or rather this is going to be a versus video against the Nvidia RTX 5070 Ti that also has 16 gigs of VRAM. Now, the reason as to why I am benchmarking these two cards against each other is because from my own research and from the general consensus online and from the benchmarking videos that I have been watching, it will seem that the 9070 is roughly on par with the RTX Nvidia 5070 Ti. Another reason as to why maybe I want to benchmark these two GPUs together is also the price difference. So you'll expect that maybe cards that two GPUs that actually perform roughly the same will be priced the same. But the Nvidia RTX 5070 Ti is a tad bit more expensive, as the Nvidia RTX 5070 Ti retails for Kenyan shillings 155,000 over here at ESGaming. At ESGaming.co.ke, while as the not Nvidia but the AMD Radeon RX 9070 XT retails for Kenyan shillings 110,000, so almost a 30,000. Actually, I think it's a 30,000 or 40,000 difference. So I'm kind of curious to benchmark these two GPUs and actually see how they will perform against each other, and maybe this will help you pick and choose which GPU you might actually want to consider for your next build.
And by the way, the CPU that I was using was an i9-12900K paired up with 16 gigs of DDR5 RAM. Now, the first game that I decided to benchmark here was Doom: The Dark Ages. It's a recent release and a pretty notorious game to run, since this is one of those games that if your graphics card doesn't support ray tracing, this game wouldn't actually even launch. So if you're like on an older GTX 10 series GPU or an older Radeon RX 5000 CPU, this game wouldn't, not CPU but GPU, this game wouldn't launch. But using the RTX 5070 Ti on nightmare settings, which I believe is the equivalent of very high, I was averaging an average FPS of 80 FPS, whereas with the same nightmare settings but with path tracing turned on, I was averaging an average FPS of 49. Switching to the AMD Radeon 9070 with the same nightmare settings, no path tracing, the 9070 was giving us an average FPS of 83, while as when I turned on path tracing, this is where the performance was drastically reduced, as I was getting actually even below 20 FPS. So I had to turn on FSR performance, which only netted me like 37 FPS on average. Now, mind you, I'm not a fan of turning on these DLSS and image upscaling features because I feel like they're cheating, and I'm more looking for the raw performance between the two GPUs. So moving on to Resident Evil 9 using the same Radeon RX 9070 XT with max settings, and this is with ray tracing set to high. Path tracing wasn't on. This GPU was averaging an average FPS of 77. Switching to the RTX 5070 Ti, I was averaging an average FPS of 63, and this is because I had already turned on path tracing, which by the way forces you to turn on DLSS. So I do believe that if DLSS wasn't being turned on, I will actually be even getting a lower FPS. But running the same settings with no path tracing, only ray tracing, same as the AMD Radeon GPU, I was averaging an FPS of 78. So these two cards are pretty much almost on par when it comes to performance in Resident Evil 9. And switching to Cyberpunk 2077, I was running the game at max settings, path tracing with no DLSS, where I was averaging an average FPS of 28. This is with the RTX 5070 Ti, while I was switching to the Radeon RX 9070 with the same settings with path tracing, I was averaging an average FPS of 20 FPS. If I switch the game to DLSS quality, which for me in using the RTX 5070, I was getting some image noise. I don't know why. I tried to restart the game a couple of times, but that issue wouldn't resolve. But I was getting an average FPS of like 60 with DLSS set to quality, whereas with no ray tracing, just running the game at like the raster performance, so no ray tracing. I was averaging an average FPS of like 70, whereas if we switch to the Radeon RX 9070, running the same game Cyberpunk with max settings, with path tracing, was getting an average FPS of 20. With ray tracing, no path tracing, I was averaging an average FPS of like 35, and with no ray tracing at all, I was averaging 90 FPS. So seems that the 9070 was a tad bit faster when it comes to raw raster performance compared to the RTX 5070 Ti. Switching to Sony's Spider-Man 2, I was running the game at max setting with very high ray tracing, and with the RTX 5070 Ti, I was averaging 56 FPS. With no ray tracing, I was averaging 97 FPS. Switching to the AMD Radeon RX 9070, I was averaging an average FPS with the same max settings with high ray tracing. I was averaging actually 100 FPS, which is kind of ridiculous that this game has such kind of a bias towards the 9070. But running the same game with no form of ray tracing, my FPS even jumped higher, where I was getting an average FPS of 185. So it will seem that the 9070 is way significantly faster than the 5070 Ti in Spider-Man 2. So this game seems to love the AMD card more. And finally, still using the same Radeon RX 9070, I launched up NFS Unbound. This is an older title, easier to run, so I was averaging an average of 120 FPS. This game doesn't have ray tracing, so I was just running the game at max setting. And switching to the RTX 5070 Ti, I was averaging an average of 138. So it will seem that here the 5070 Ti is a tad bit faster than the Radeon 9070 using the same max settings. And again, remember, this game doesn't have any form of ray tracing. So as you can see, it's kind of a mixed bag, where sometimes the 9070 pulls ahead, where sometimes the RTX 5070 also pulls ahead. But one thing that is undeniable, it will seem that Nvidia is still the king of ray tracing and path tracing, as you did see that in Doom the Dark Ages with the Nvidia GPU with path tracing. I was actually getting a very decent playable FPS even with no DLSS involved. So yeah, AMD still on ray tracing. They are coming up, and as you saw in Spider-Man, I was playing ray tracing. Not path tracing, by the way, it was just ray tracing. In Spider-Man, the 9070 was way faster. So yeah, it's maybe a case where AMD needs to optimize their drivers even more, but I'm surprised that the 9070 is actually able to go toe-to-toe with the 5070 Ti. So I would say, if you're not doing like things that require CUDA cores, these are the special cores that Nvidia GPUs have, your workflow doesn't require them, then I would actually suggest getting the 9070 for its more affordable price, since it will give you sort of, if not even sometimes, more performance than the RTX 5070 Ti. And again, remember these two GPUs. For the 5070 Ti, this one retails for 155,000, and for the 9070, this one retails for 110,000 over here at ESGaming.co.ke.